welcome to the virtual Hammer Museum, coming to you live from Los Angeles. I'm Claudia Bester, I'm the Director of Public Programs, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's Hammer Forum on the Department of Justice's recent dismissal of charges against Michael Flynn, President Trump's former National Security Advisor. Flynn was charged with and pled guilty to lying to members of the FBI during the Mueller investigation. So today we'll discuss what all this means for the future of law enforcement in the United States with former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, an ex-FBI agent turned law professor Asha Rangappa, and our moderator tonight is law professor Jessica Levinson. Before we get started, I have a few notes for the audience. This program is being conducted via Zoom webinar, and in a Zoom webinar, we cannot see you in the audience and we can't hear you. We can just see your names and anything that you type into the chat box and the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. So we'd love for you all to introduce yourselves in the chat box and tell us where you're tuning in from. The chat's also an area where the audience can all talk with each other. And the Q&A box is where you type in questions you have for the panelists, and it'll help them if you specify who the question is for. Please note that this program is being recorded and will be available later on the Hammer website. Also, if you'd like to receive reminder emails about upcoming events, please sign up for our email list on the Hammer website, and you can also find recordings of most of our past public programs on the Hammer website as well. So now on to today's program. The Hammer Forum is a monthly series of public discussions about current social and political issues, and it's made possible with support from the Rosenblum family. In today's forum, we're hoping to clarify the ongoing Michael Flynn case, and our guest speakers have vast experience behind the scenes in the Department of Justice and in the intelligence community. The Honorable Joyce White Vance was the United States Attorney in the Northern District of Alabama from August 2009 to January 2017. She was appointed by President Obama and unanimously confirmed by the Senate, and she served on the Attorney General's Advisory Committee from 2009 to 2011. She also co-chaired the Criminal Practice Subcommittee of the Attorney General's Advisory Committee from 2009 to 2017. Vance's focus on civil rights included filing the first ever investigation into a statewide prison system using the new Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons laws. And she successfully challenged Alabama's HB 56 immigration bill and settled a voting rights dispute with the state of Alabama that brought it into compliance with the Motor Voter Act. She created a community-engaged initiative to fight the epidemic of heroin and prescription opiate addiction, for which she received the University of Alabama at Birmingham's Public Health Hero Award. Among her many major criminal prosecutions were the first material support of terrorism case in Alabama, the major fraud prosecutions of a Birmingham healthcare CEO, the director of the Alabama Small Business Consortium, and the executive director of Birmingham's JCCEO, and the prosecution of a man who attempted to hire an individual he believes to be a KKK hitman to murder his African-American neighbor. Prior to being named U.S. Attorney, Vance served in the criminal division of the U.S. Attorney's Office from 1991 to 2002, when she moved to the appellate division. She became chief of that division in 2005. And before joining the U.S. Attorney's Office, she worked as a litigator in private practice with Arendt, Fox, Kinter, Plotkin, and Kahn in Washington, D.C. Asha Rangappa is a senior lecturer at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, and she's a former associate dean at Yale Law School. Prior to her current position, she served as a special agent in the New York division of the FBI, specializing in counterintelligence investigations. Her work involved assessing threats to national security, conducting classified investigations on suspected foreign agents, and performing undercover work. While in the FBI, she gained extensive experience in intelligence tradecraft, electronic surveillance, interview and interrogation techniques, and firearms and the use of deadly force. She's taught national security law and related courses at Yale, Wesleyan, and at the University of New Haven. She's published op-eds in the New York Times, the Atlantic, and the Washington Post, and is an editor for the journal Just Security, and is currently a legal and national security analyst for CNN. Our moderator tonight is Jessica Levinson. Levinson is a professor of law at Loyola Law School, where she's also the founding director of the Loyola Law Public Service Institute, which trains the next generation of leaders in government service. She studies the laws of the political process, including election law and governance issues. Her work focuses on ethics, political corruption, voting rights, campaign finance, ballot initiatives, redistricting, term limits, and state budgets. Until last year, Levinson served as the president of the Los Angeles Ethics Commission, And previously, she served as Director of Political Reform at the Center for Governmental Studies, a nonprofit research organization that looks at ethics and campaign financing. Levinson has a weekly legal segment on KCRW's Press Play and frequently contributes op-ed pieces to NBC.com. In addition, she appears regularly on MSNBC, CNN, CBS, NBC, and Fox News, and is a go-to source for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Associated Press, the LA Times, and Politico, among many other media outlets. So now please join me in welcoming our moderator, Jessica Levinson.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited about this panel. And I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces in the participants list. And I will say good news for you. Unlike last week, we have truly some guest stars, emphasis on stars here. So I'm going to get to them very quickly. I think we all know what we're doing here. We're talking about what I've called it as the curious case of Michael Flynn and what's happening with respect to his court case right now and what that means for the Department of Justice. So what I want to do first is I want to get a little audience participation, and I'm going to launch a poll now. It's just 2 questions. I'm going to launch it in the beginning, and then hopefully I'll remember again at the end and see if anybody's kind of the same thing we did together last week and see if anybody's mind changed on this. So it is a very short poll, and hopefully you should all be seeing it. Although, yes, okay, now people are starting to vote. Let me say, I hope your voter participation is more than what we would expect in the 2020 election. And I'm going to allow just a couple more seconds of voting. Again, the question, should the Department of Justice dismiss the case against Michael Flynn? Should the federal judge in charge of the case allow the DOJ to dismiss that case? And I'm going to go ahead and we have some overwhelming results here. All right, so we have 96%. We would never come to this sort of agreement, I think, on anything else in America in 2020. 96% yes for no for number 1, and 93% no for number 2. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to really briefly ask for the slides to come up. And this is just a roadmap. So this is what we're talking about: tampering with the Department of Justice. And then I'm going to ask for slide number 2, the last slide. And really, generally, this is our roadmap for tonight. This is where I'd like to go, basically starting at the beginning, talking about who Michael Flynn is, how he became part of the administration, all the way down to what's happening today. So I'm going to go ahead and ask for the slide to come down and ask for the amazing panelists to be brought in. And while we're waiting for them, there we see, I see one of the professors is on, and I'm just going to give it, there we go. We're all here now. Professors, I think for tonight, I'm going to try and create a little kind of false intimacy and go with first names, if that's okay. Because we're all kind of,
sounds great.
We're all kind of in somebody's living room, dining room, or you know, even we had some great pictures of people watching in their backyard. So, Asha, I think the first question to you, can you tell us a little bit about who Michael Flynn is and how he came to be part of the Trump campaign?
Yeah, so Michael Flynn is a general. He worked on the Trump campaign, and he was a part of the campaign through the transition period after Trump was elected. I think that he has to be viewed in the big picture of what the FBI would have been looking at if we can mentally rewind to June of 2016. That was when they opened the case called Crossfire Hurricane. This was about Russia's interference in the 2016 election and whether they might be targeting members of the campaign in that interference effort. And some of the people in there were, as all these, names we all are household names now. George Papadopoulos, whose drunken confession in a bar kind of prompted the opening of this investigation. Paul Manafort, who they knew had links to, Russia before, same with Carter Page. So they're kind of viewing all of these people in the Trump orbit. What we know about what led to this case is that in December of 2016, Obama takes a step of expelling 35 Russian diplomats from the United States. This is called doing a PNG, which is declaring these diplomats persona non grata. These Russians were likely spies, and this expulsion, in addition to imposing sanctions, was intended to be a harsh rebuke and punishment for the interference in the 2016 election. I have done PNGs before in the FBI. They're incredibly difficult because even when there are spies in the United States, they're often operating under diplomatic cover, so you can't prosecute them. And if you kick them out, there's usually something called a tit for tat, where that country will kick out one of our CIA officers. So the State Department doesn't really want you to do it. The CIA doesn't want you to do it. So, it's very rare. I just want to put this out there. It's very rare to do a PNG. And when a country does it, you might do 1 or 2. And it's very embarrassing to the other country. Obama did 35. This was intended to send an incredibly strong and unequivocal statement to Russia. The FBI then captures on its counterintelligence surveillance, a phone call between Michael Flynn and the Russian ambassador to the US, Sergei Kislyak, in which he tells the Russian ambassador not to retaliate, not to do a tit for tat, and then also is discussing potential votes at the UN, and basically saying, look, lay low, we will make things right for you once we're in power. This has a lot of implications, but what really piqued the FBI's, apart from the fact that he's having these conversations with the Russian ambassador and trying to kind of counter the statement that the United States is making, is that it wasn't clear whether this call was coming at the direction of, the president or the vice president. But the vice president 2 weeks later goes on television. This call had somehow gotten into the press, and he basically says, Michael Flynn, assured me that this, call didn't happen. So this creates, from a counterintelligence perspective, a risk, because at this point, Michael Flynn is basically tapped to become the next national security advisor, the person in a position to make critical decisions for the national security of the United States. And the question is, if he's in fact lied to his bosses, and he's had some secret phone call where he's promised something to the Russians, and the Russians now know that he's lied, this creates a potentially compromised situation. Is he working on Russia's behalf? What is going on? And so they go and they interview him, which would be a normal thing to do if you're trying to get to the bottom of what exactly is happening here. And in the course of that interview, they even jog his memory with kind of actual, verbiage from the call. And he says that he didn't make those statements. So, this is a bad situation because it's called lying to the FBI. It's a violation of 18 U.S.C. 1001, and that is what he is being prosecuted for. He decided to cooperate with Mueller's team. This is later on, after Mueller became the special counsel. He also retroactively registered as a foreign agent for Turkey during this entire time when he was in the campaign. And he pleaded guilty, was cooperating, and then that fell apart. And now we're at this position where, and I think he also tried to withdraw his plea agreement at one point and the judge didn't let him. But now we're at the part where after all this time, the Attorney General is coming in and saying, we want to drop this case. And so I'll turn it over to Joyce at that point to let her pick up the story.
That's perfect. And actually, if it's okay, I mean, there was so much good information there. There's a reason that we have the all-star panel from CNN and MSNBC respectively with us. Joyce, if you can, could you walk us through what Michael Flynn, Asha talked about this, but what he could have been charged with, and then ultimately what he was charged with, and maybe why that decision was made?
I think that's exactly the right question to start with when we talk about Michael Flynn. You know, I don't know what you all see in your mind when you think about this man in this case. I always start with that photo of him speaking in Russia, sitting at the head table with Vladimir Putin and Jill Stein. And this very, as you said, Jessica, the curious case of Michael Flynn, right? How do you go from the Obama White House to Vladimir Putin's dinner table and on into the Trump White House? And what would we think about an FBI that had not, once it learned that he was lying about conversations that they captured on tape with Ambassador Kislyak? What if the FBI just said, nah, not a big deal, we'll just let this go? Sure, you know, the next director of national security may have told lies in public that the Russians know that are lies so that they can blackmail him, but we're just not going to pursue that. You don't have to be an FBI agent like Asha. You just need some common sense to know that he's going to be interviewed at that point. And I'm just going to assume that the agents who went over to that White House that day, a sort of unusual visit, went over to do the interview, that they expected that there would be some form of explanation and acknowledgement. I don't think that they expected to hear a denial, because Mike Flynn should have known that his conversations with Kislyak would have been captured by our intelligence service. Somebody in his position should have known that. So this case just keeps devolving into more layers of curiousness. But here's what I think as a prosecutor. Yes, he has lied to federal agents, and this is the statute Asha refers to, 18 U.S. Code 1001. It's sort of a bread and butter statute. As a federal prosecutor, you really like this one. For one thing, the sentence caps at 5 years. And so if you charge a defendant with something like this, as opposed to one of the fraud statutes or money laundering, or something that carries a much longer time potential sentence, it's a liability limiting device that prosecutors often use for a defendant who's going to cooperate with them and offer something of value, particularly in a white collar crime, a public corruption case, or as in here, a case that has this sort of foreign dimension to it. So it's a bread and butter statute. The question is, why was Mike Flynn charged with this? Was this the only charge that was available, or could he have been charged with much more? We don't know the answer to that for sure. We do know that he failed to register as an agent of a foreign country. That fair charge is not something that prosecutors had historically brought or had much success when they brought, but certainly a possible charge. But we've heard a lot of speculation about Mike Flynn, and we just don't know, I think, is the short answer. There's a whole scenario involving Turkey and a potential kidnapping scam involving a figure that the Turkish government was less than pleased with, and a lot of other possibilities. And I remember, you know, back at this point in 2017, where we saw the Flynn indictment, and every former federal prosecutor that I talked to, and maybe some current ones too, thought that it signaled a deal. And the public story was that Mike Flynn was cooperating. And the assumption was that that cooperation had to be something very significant. And, you know, we went into the plea hearing and the sentencing where Judge Sullivan used language like treason and essentially refused to sentence him to a sentence that didn't include custody, because Judge Sullivan had sort of peeked behind the curtain of redacted material and seen a lot more than the public was aware of, and had a bad reaction to what Mike Flynn had done and to the deal that the government was about to give him. I think that there's still a lot of mystery there, and my instinct says that there's more to Mike Flynn's saga than what we actually know. But the reality is, this is the plea deal. Government recommended a non-custodial sentence I think that you all probably have some familiarity with federal sentencing. It's based on actually the sentencing guidelines. The statute might say up to and including 5 years, but the sentencing guidelines would give a much lighter sentence, in this case, a range of 0 to 6 months. And so for Flynn, the recommendation was no custody, signaling that he had a lot of value to give to Bob Mueller. We haven't really seen anything along those lines, though. I'll stop there for now.
Jessica, I just want to add in here
Please.
in terms of the curious case. Remember that the investigation into Flynn, which later became his prosecution, was what Trump originally asked then Director James Comey to drop. I hope you can see your way clear to letting this go. And he wanted that Flynn investigation to go away. It seems a little odd if it was just the lie. I mean, he was very keen on that particular investigation not moving further, and it was really the refusal to do that that led him to fire Comey. So I think this kind of goes to what Joyce is saying, that if we read between the lines, it does seem like there was a lot more there. And the fact that Trump seems keen on, talking up Michael Flynn, just like he does with Manafort, and somehow keeping them placated also tells me that, there might be more beans that could be spilled, in my opinion.
That's exactly where I wanted to go with you, which is basically first remind us of when President Trump first started. Well, remind us of why President Trump said Michael Flynn had to be fired. And then exactly what you just did was remind us when President Trump first interfered with this particular case. And it was, as you said, that, please go easy on my friends. And then ultimately that apparently is what started the Mueller investigation, where Michael Flynn was one of the highest level prosecutions to spin off of that.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think, there was this window before or right after Trump was inaugurated where, Sally Yates, the national security threat that was being perceived by the FBI and DOJ was so acute that Sally Yates went to the White House to speak to the White House counsel, Don McGahn, about, that Flynn may have lied to the vice president. He lied to the FBI. And I think that there was, the sense that he might be blackmailed by Russia. But again, I think the sense of urgency there suggests that there might be something else as well. And it was really only after some, pressure and some delay that Trump fired him. And he issued a tweet, I remember, as soon as he did that, I had to fire Mike Flynn. And it's too bad because, he didn't even do anything wrong, which, is another story that kind of goes to the underwriting of our foreign policy, which I mentioned before. And yes, and so this becomes later the topic where he asks Comey to drop the investigation. And then after he fires Comey, this question of asking him to drop it is one of the 10 acts of obstruction that is later laid out in the Moller Report in terms of this kind of pattern of obstruction. And there's these 10, in the law we say actus reus, like there's 10 acts here that are evincing a sense of corrupt motive in terms of wanting to stop the Russia investigation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember those tweets, and I remember that kind of half-hearted firing of Michael Flynn. And then, of course, what has continued to be, and if we're going to maybe wrap up later by talking about broader patterns, this pattern of publicly supporting Michael Flynn throughout, which will bring us somewhere around Chapter 4. But maybe to stay, Joyce, on Chapter 3, we touched on this a little bit when Asha gave that great summary of kind of where we've come, but could you walk us through a little bit more of when the case was filed? Michael Flynn had a specific tact, which was obviously pleading guilty, and then things changed pretty dramatically in terms of his approach to the case.
This is one of the increasingly curious factors about this case, because Flynn gets really good lawyers, a DC firm called Covington and Burling, and pretty quickly determines that it's in his best interests to plead guilty, right? He's got this sweetheart deal, a charge that caps at 5 years, but he knows he's going to get sentenced much lower. He's all in. I'll even, say he's in like Flynn, right? I mean, he wants to plead guilty. And here's the condition of pleading guilty and cooperating. Federal prosecutors require you to tell the whole truth about everything that you know, to disclose other crimes. You don't get to hold anything back, even about a family member. So there's this little sideshow that goes on here about Mike Flynn's son and whether or not he's potentially a target of the investigation. But Flynn indicates that he is completely willing to cooperate and to plead guilty. And that's really how it looks. There's a little bit of trouble when he goes in to plead guilty. He sort of balks in the middle of the plea agreement. That happens sometimes in guilty pleas. Defendants haven't been through them time and time again like federal prosecutors have, and ultimately he successfully pleads guilty. And everything looks like it's on track. There's a principle here that's worth mentioning, and that's the finality of guilty pleas in the federal system. In order for a judge to successfully accept a guilty plea, he or she has to walk through a series of steps with the defendant. The defendant has to acknowledge that he's pleading guilty because he or she is in fact guilty, that he hasn't received any promises that aren't part of the record. In other words, you have a written guilty plea. If a prosecutor said, and by the way, if you do that, I'll pay you $1 million, or we'll make sure your wife doesn't go to jail. You can't do that. It has to all be disclosed. The judge walks through all of these steps, gives a defendant notification of his rights. It's a very serious process. And once you tell the judge that you do want to enter a plea of guilt and the judge accepts it, it's very difficult for a defendant to revoke that plea. Our system works best if we know that a plea is final, that it can't be endlessly relitigated absent certain situations where a defendant isn't properly advised of his rights or isn't knowingly and voluntarily pleading guilty. But in Flynn's case, that all goes through. And one assumes that he's on to sentencing. And I think we've talked, and you know that there were problems with the first sentencing here, where the judge sent Flynn back for further cooperation and consideration. And Jessica, stop me if I'm headed too far on into what you want to save for chapter 4.
No, this is perfect.
But along the way here, Flynn gets a new lawyer and everything changes. But it's not really the lawyer that changes everything. There's another change that seems to influence Flynn's case. And that's when Bill Barr becomes the Attorney General. The Moller Report is released. There is a misleading, at best, summary of that report. I'll say summary in quotes, that's released to the public, that's misleading about what Mueller finds. There's a real change in tone about the consequences of activity involved in the report. And as the whitewash of the Mueller process begins, compliments of Bill Barr, Flynn picks up speed too. There's an interesting piece where all along his son had been using Twitter and public statements to say that his dad wasn't guilty and was getting a raw deal. And many people thought that that was sort of a dangerous thing to do, that the lawyers needed to tamp down on the son. It turns out, though, that that was sort of the canary in the coal mine. And as this process goes on, it becomes increasingly clear that Flynn is headed towards withdrawing his plea, this very unusual action. And so I won't get too far into where we are today unless you want me to, but ultimately we end up in this space where Flynn is seeking to put the prosecutors on trial, right? Not just to withdraw a plea, but actually to prosecute the prosecutors. And as this case gets even more curious, he's doing that with the Attorney General's help.
No, that was everything I hoped for and more. I mean, that's exactly right. As we all watch this, and I've only been in a federal courtroom for criminal proceedings, luckily on the clerk's side of things, but I remember how lengthy those guilty pleas were. And I said to my judge one time, come on, we know they agreed. Can't we speed this up? And he said, absolutely not. This is for a very good reason.
And let me just underscore how serious that is. I was once in one of these plea situations. It started and stopped and started and stopped. The defendant kept wanting to go out of the courtroom and talk to his lawyer. And the judge missed in his colloquy. The judges sort of have a bench book to make sure that they ask all the right questions. The judge missed a relatively innocuous question. None of us picked up on it at the time. The 11th Circuit reversed the case and sent it back to the court for the judge to retake that plea. So these are very serious proceedings.
Please.
And we can save this for when you want to cover it. But I do want to talk about the different stories that Mike Flynn has given to the court again and again. As Joyce mentioned, he did make this attempt to withdraw his plea, and there was initially a play on blaming the FBI agents first for having somehow, engaged in misconduct and, tricked him, which is a little bit different than what Bill Barr is now. Like, he's making a completely different legal agreement. But, if you want to go into what that interview looked like and why that was not, the FBI, again, as I mentioned before, as a part of their counterintelligence mission, when they see that there may be some kind of national security threat, they can and do go ask questions. In Michael Flynn's case, this was a voluntary interview. So, they called him, they said they want to interview him, and he agreed. And he was not in custody, and this makes a difference. There were some things floating around. I don't know if this was a allegation he made, but there were a lot of right-wing commentators at the time that said he needed to have been Mirandized. You don't Mirandize someone when they are not in custody, and they are free to leave, and they're having this voluntary interview. And he was willingly answering their questions. The other little tidbit that was making the rounds was that the FBI was required to advise him that lying to the FBI is a crime. So here's a news flash to everybody that's watching, just in case the FBI knocks on your door. Lying to the FBI is a crime. But this is something that Mike Flynn should have known. He was the former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He was a member of the intelligence community. He's worked with the FBI. This would have been knowledge to him. But in any case, the FBI isn't required to advise someone of that. So he had these ideas of FBI misconduct. Ultimately, though, when he was asked directly by a judge, he did come clean and say that that's not what he was alleging. And maybe Joyce has a little bit more information on that. That was just a very weird episode where he alleged something, and then when he was pressed on it, walked it back. And it really wasn't clear what the purpose of that was, except it seemed to me to simply put out into the public narrative a story that could gain kind of the circulation and create some of these, these, narratives that I'm talking about, without actually having to go on record in the court as, ultimately saying that this is what he was alleging, which I assume he would have had to have been stood by, and that would have exposed him to potential other legal risk, of course, telling a court that. So I'm interested in what Joyce's take was on that episode.
And that's the key, Asha, as you say, he's in court because a defendant, when he pleads guilty, is placed under oath at the beginning of the hearing. And so we start during this plea to hear a little bit of the conspiracy theory, and it stops and starts. Flynn talks to his lawyer. He's reminded that he's under oath. And he walks back from making these allegations about agent misconduct. It is all in all a very curious situation, and something that we haven't mentioned yet. And I know I keep saying that it's a curious situation, but I say that because there are so many unanswered questions, and none of this happens the way one would expect it to. And another really interesting sideshow that's going on here is that the president is dangling pardons for all the world to see mostly Mike Flynn and Paul Manafort on this same timeline, as if to say, look how I can help my friends, look how I can help my supporters. And so Mike Flynn is pleading guilty, but at the same time, there's this little narrative that almost appears to be setting up an out for him, a way to stay in the president's good graces. And that, I think, is why it's so important to note that at the point where Flynn is under oath, he says, yes, I'm pleading guilty because I committed these crimes. And he walks back away from allegations of misconduct. Seems to me that the most authoritative version of what's happening is the version that you get from the defendant when he's testifying under oath under penalty of perjury.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like you could teach a whole criminal law semester, just a criminal procedure semester as well, on what happened, and essentially teaching people that this is not normal, that no part of this is normal. And I do absolutely at the end want to pick up on, this issue of kind of the backdoor pardons. If this in fact is, if the president is really just leaning on the attorney general who's showing very little independence, then is this just a pardon kind of by any other name, but one that really undermines the judicial system in the process? So I can't believe it's been 40 minutes, but it has. And therefore, I feel like we should I'd like to get to kind of fast forward a little bit and talk about, we had this whole strange up and back where under oath there's a guilty plea, then there's a pullback of the guilty plea, and then there's this kind of campaign of trying to change the narrative in both the courtroom and outside the courtroom. And so I want to bring us to April, frankly. We're in COVID time now, so time kind of slows down. Every day feels like a month. And talk about what the president has been saying leading up to this time about Michael Flynn, and then what Attorney General Barr asked the Department of Justice to do. So I guess a little bit before April, in fact. And I think, Joyce, if you want to start with that one, that would be wonderful.
So Trump has had this litany for the last few months as Flynn hung in limbo. Flynn was a good guy who got a raw deal. This is part of the Trump narrative of the deep state coming after Trump and his campaign. It seemed very strange, very unusual, for one thing, for a president to intervene in a criminal case. This is the sort of thing that where a president inadvertently comments on a criminal case, he then bends over backwards to walk it back to avoid influence. But not Trump, who just continues to really march into territory where most angels would fear to tread. And so we then have this really interesting scenario where, as the team prepares to head towards sentencing, suddenly we learn that one of the lawyers on this case has withdrawn from the case, and the Justice Department makes a request that the judge dismiss the prosecution of Mike Flynn. I would say that this is better than a pardon, right? Because when you get pardoned, you're guilty. That's a component of the pardon. This is making the case go away as though it had never happened in the first place. It is spectacularly unusual to see this happen in a case where a defendant has under oath pleaded guilty and said that he committed the crime. Here, Bill Barr's Justice Department argues that what Flynn did was not a crime. I don't know, Asha, what you think about that, but I've prosecuted a lot of 1001 cases. If the conduct in this particular situation is not criminal, if it's not the kind of case that DOJ should be prosecuting, then there are a lot of cases out there, both past and current and future prosecutions, that DOJ shouldn't be in the business of bringing. This bread and butter statute that's used so widely has lost its teeth if it can't be applied to Mike Flynn in a situation where he knowingly lied to FBI agents and acknowledged that he did so. I think it's difficult to overstate not just how unusual this is, but how serious it is, what a major violation it is of the rule of law. When this motion to withdraw the plea, and it's worth pointing out, by the way, that DOJ can't just dismiss a case on its own. DOJ has to do that with leave of court. It's not a very high standard for the court. I mean, there's not some sort of a formal high-level burden of proof. The court just has to say, okay, that's okay. You can go ahead and dismiss this prosecution. And usually it happens when DOJ comes into court and says, Judge, we've maybe lost a piece of evidence. Maybe you have a gun case and the gun has been suppressed because you have a bad search. So lacking evidence that you would need to obtain a conviction, you move to dismiss the case. Maybe a witness lied to you in the grand jury and you find that out very late and you go in really with egg on your face in that situation. Exceedingly unusual to ask the judge to dismiss. In many ways, it's a protection for the defendant. Here, DOJ walks into court with the U.S. attorney, the acting U.S. attorney, signing off on the pleading and essentially saying, we'd like to give a pass to the president's buddy. You know, that sweetheart deal Trump asked Jim Comey for that Comey wouldn't deliver. We'd like you to do that for us now, Judge. And I mean, I say that, I don't mean to be funny or cavalier when I say that. It's shocking, it's appalling, it violates the rule of law. There's nothing normal about this sort of lack of separation between DOJ and the White House.
Yeah, there's a lot I want to pick up on there, but Asha, there's some things served up to you if you want to.
Yeah, so I'll just hit on a few points because Joyce did such a great job. I would say that 1001 lying to federal agents, not just the bread and butter, but especially applicable to someone who is about to take a position of public trust. That we expect truthfulness and accountability, especially when the FBI is asking about a national security matter from the incoming national security advisor to the United States, who is expected to act in the public interest. So I think it was especially appropriate to prosecute him for that false statement. And as far as Barr's motion, you know, the legal argument that he's making, he's actually not denying that Flynn lied.
Yeah.
What he is saying is that this lie was not material. In other words, it didn't matter to anything. There was no investigation for which this was actually relevant. And what he's doing is he's saying more than it's not a crime. He's saying that an incoming national security advisor having, you know, secret conversations as a private citizen, by the way, that are unknown to the sitting government and, you know, who hides it from our law enforcement that is trying to protect our national security, that's totally fine. And that should never even have been investigated in the first place. They had no right to be asking him questions about it. That is the crux of what he is saying. And I think that we should all be alarmed if that is the position, because what he wants to do is open a space where that is okay and is off limits to the FBI. And if you ask me, I think that that bodes very scary for the upcoming election. The last thing I'll say is it's worse than a pardon. You know, the pardon power is, it exists side by side with the justice system. It allows the justice system to take its course. The person is still adjudicated as guilty, and it accepts the person as guilty in deciding to pardon them. You're granting mercy. That's what you're doing. What Barr is doing is basically taking away that accountability, because when the president pardons someone, he has to take responsibility for that pardon. We've seen presidents pardon people, and it's controversial all the time. He's trying to take the hit and shift the blame onto the prosecutors and the FBI and make them the guilty parties, not Flynn. And this really, you know, confuses the accountability that we need in a democracy, especially when we're going towards an election.
You know, I can't underline that enough, Asha, because you know, like I do, right? As a prosecutor or an agent, you're used to the defense lawyer putting your conduct on trial. What's so shocking here is that it's the Attorney General and the President putting the conduct of career public servants on trial.
I think that's a perfect segue to what I wanted to talk about. And I think we probably don't have maybe enough time for the specific question, although maybe we'll get to it in the Q&A, but this division between appointed members of the Department of Justice and then the career prosecutors, and how we see these silent withdrawals, even in this case, and what that means. But I do want to make sure we get to this point, which is, let's put a pin in Flynn for a minute. And I'm so sorry to everyone listening that I made that terrible rhyme. Let's zoom back and say, why is it so important to have an independent Department of Justice? The Attorney General is appointed. Obviously, that's going to be a political action. The Attorney General does not, like federal judges, serve for life, where we think, yes, it's a political appointment, but then we magically take you out of the political sphere. So you just make decisions that are correct on the law and you have no political pressure. So why, and I think, Asha, you started to talk about this, so we'll go Asha, Joyce, if that's okay. Why do we care so much that this is an independent agency?
Well, I think that we accept it as, the only way that the rule of law can function in a democracy is to be independent from political influence. I think that it seems almost, self-evident. But I will say there's nothing in the Constitution that requires the enforcement of the laws to be independent. I mean, there's nothing in there that spells out the FBI and that the president will not interfere. Actually, we owe a lot of that to the legacy of the FBI's first director, J. Edgar Hoover, who, for whatever reason, his own, political reasons or strategic reasons, kept every president and every White House at arm's length because he did not want to be beholden to anybody. And there are, very checkered things that came from that, but I think there is a legacy that came from that, which is a norm that we have really come to adopt. And that's where I think where we've been shocked over the last 4 years is that we're realizing this is a norm. It's not written down anywhere. These are protocols that presidents have observed. When Bill Clinton was being investigated, when Reagan was being investigated for Iran-Contra, they accepted that this is how it happens. And what we have is a president that is willing to break this norm, just like he's broken many norms. And I think it's only in the breaking of these norms that we are understanding how dangerous it becomes when law enforcement becomes essentially an extension of the person sitting in the White House. That's what we, have typically lectured, other countries about and warned them about, corruption in law enforcement. And I think that's what we're starting to see in our own country. And I'll let Joyce pick it up from there.
I teach first-year criminal law at the University of Alabama School of Law, and I tell my students on the first day in criminal law that the study of criminal law is really a civil rights class. It's the study about when the government can lock you up and put you in jail, when it can take away your freedom. We all know what banana republics look like. We all know what dictatorships look like. Those are countries where the people who are in power can take their opponents and have them locked up, not because they've committed crimes in an objective sense, but because they stand in the way of powerful people. And that in many ways is the compelling narrative of America, of the rule of law in this country, of the notion that no one, not even the president, is above the law. And at the same time that we're all entitled to have our rights observed, no matter who we are. That's what's happened here that's so terribly wrong. This notion that justice is no longer objective and that perhaps the president's friends or maybe his enemies receive some form of different treatment in this sense. So when we look at the situation involving Mike Flynn and really this entire trajectory, we have to think about whether America and these foundational principles that made us different, that made us great, that helped us achieve a better quality of life because we had more of an expectation of fairness, whether those sort of principles can survive in this setting. And I think that's what Asha demonstrates when she talks about the rule of law here and the notion that we have historically been a shining example for other countries. I have a friend, a former US attorney from Wisconsin, who still does work with the ABA, going to foreign countries and talking about the rule of law. And he has said it becomes increasingly more difficult to do that kind of work in today's environment. That's, I think, a shameful explanation of where we find ourselves.
And can I add
Yeah.
one more thing to that, Jessica, is,
Of course.
and this kind of relates back to Flynn. There is a particular family of crimes which are called process crimes. You might have heard that term.
Yes.
Which involve crimes that really impede the judicial process. Things like lying to investigators, obstructing justice, witness tampering, perjury. And these are the pillars of the rule of law. You can't have a just system if you can't protect the integrity of that system. And I just want to point that out because there's a lot of poo-pooing about, oh, it's just lying to the FBI, it's just obstruction, just a little witness tampering. These are what make the justice system. And they happen to also be the crimes that Trump has particular contempt for. If you look at the people that he has pardoned in the past, it's been for obstruction and false statements, that really is subverting this idea that these are integral to how the judicial system operates.
I think you're absolutely right. I hear this kind of wave off of, oh, it's just a process crime. It's not a real crime. And those are, as you say, really fundamental to our respect for the rule of law. And to pick up on what both of you were saying, I think in so many ways, we see the current administration like a stress test on our Constitution. And we're seeing that in so many areas, the walls crack because we've never had an 8.0, basically, because the Constitution is kind of, in my mind, designed under the idea that we trust each other, but we don't trust each other all that much. And so we're going to have the system of checks and balances, and we're going to have some oversight. And so we think people might be a little dishonest. They might transgress the bounds of these norms a little bit, but we don't think they're going to go well past. And in so many ways, I feel that that's what we've seen today, where you see, the Trump administration saying, I'm just not responding to subpoenas, period. Or I'm going to lean on the Attorney General to become involved in this particular case, or I'm going to bypass Congress and treat an executive order in this way. So I guess I'll take my moderator's privilege for a moment and say, the Constitution is just this genius and maddening document, and we expect some bad behavior, but we don't expect you to basically just completely step out of the paradigm and say, no, thank you to that. So the last question I asked you, and let's bring it back, is, why is it important to have an independent Department of Justice? There's another branch where we expect some independence, and that's the judiciary. And so I want to go back to the court case now, and I want to go back to Judge Sullivan. And specifically, we talked about this a little bit in the beginning, and now I want to go into a little more detail. How much discretion at this point does Judge Sullivan have? And of course, it can't be, we know, just the Department of Justice that waves a magic wand and says, we're all done here, thank you. How much discretion does Judge Sullivan have, and what action did Judge Sullivan take before kind of blessing this? So what recently happened in terms of Judge Sullivan asking for more information, essentially? I think, Joyce, I think you're next in the queue.
So it's a very interesting situation, and I think we should start by acknowledging it's not entirely clear what the judge could do. Could he actually out and out say, sorry, DOJ, you can't dismiss this case. You have to go ahead and prosecute it. Not sure. It's an interesting juncture. What he did do, I think, is something that's very interesting. He's guaranteeing a fair process. Since DOJ won't prosecute its case, he has now appointed an amicus a former judge to come in and represent essentially the interests of the people of the United States in having this case prosecuted. So there's a period of several months, culminating with a hearing during July in which the court will take argument, in addition to the former judge who will be stepping into the shoes of the Justice Department. There is a group of former DOJ employees, I'm one of them, amicus, who are represented in a lawsuit explaining not why it's important to prosecute Michael Flynn per se, but talking about protecting the process and ensuring the finality of guilty pleas, and urging the judge to go ahead and move to sentencing without permitting DOJ to dismiss this case in which the guilty plea was already properly taken. I think legally that's a sustainable course of action. Michael Flynn's lawyer just today responded to the judge's orders by filing a motion, in essence seeking to leapfrog the district judge, taking the decision out of his hands and going straight to the Court of Appeals, telling them that they should order the judge, that they should mandamus him and order him to permit DOJ to dismiss the case, and also that they should remove this judge, Judge Sullivan. And the language that Flynn's lawyer uses is, she says he just doesn't understand the facts of this case, which I think is her way of saying that he won't perceive these facts the way we would like him to perceive them. It is, I think, a disingenuous motion. You know, the federal rules of procedure say that lawyers shouldn't file frivolous motions. This, I think, borders on being frivolous. Typically, mandamus is reserved for extraordinary situations after a court has acted, encouraging it to take appropriate action. This is, I think, a very distressing motion, and seeing how the Court of Appeals will choose to handle it, and if they'll permit Judge Sullivan to proceed with his case, is very important. I'm going to go out on a limb here and make a prediction, which I don't usually do because I have a terrible crystal ball when it comes to courts. I think Judge Sullivan will be permitted to go ahead with proceedings and to make a ruling in this case, and then there will be an appeal. But this effort by Flynn's lawyer to completely bypass the district court seems to me to be very inappropriate and out of step with where we are in these proceedings.
Yeah, Asha, I saw you tweet about this a little bit as it was breaking news that this appeal was filed. Again, pretty extraordinary filing to the Court of Appeals, and essentially, as Joyce said, is just trying to leapfrog over the process and say, no, don't get that additional information. Just make the decision and let us continue. And so I wanted to give you a moment on that as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think they're clearly terrified of this other argument being made on behalf of the people of the United States. And, it seems to me that even in appointing that amicus, there is implicitly a vote of no confidence that, Barr's Justice Department is actually representing the interests of the United States. It seems a quite unusual step to take. I do want to just kind of zoom back out a little bit and emphasize the process point that Joyce made, which is this isn't just about the finality of a guilty plea. This prosecution was a product of the Special Counsel investigation into Russian interference. The Special Counsel was appointed by the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, because there was a conflict of interest that required, in this matter of, great interest and public interest, an independent prosecutor to handle all aspects of the case. It defeats the entire purpose of the Special Counsel regulations. If you could appoint a special counsel, the special counsel can go through the entire investigation, file these charges, bring these prosecutions, and then it goes back to a political appointee who just goes back into court and tries to dismiss all the cases, which is exactly what's happening right now. We've seen him try to interfere in the Roger Stone case. We've seen him move to dismiss some of the charges actually the charges against Russia. And so there is this kind of systematic dismantling of what was supposed to be an insulated and independent investigation within the independence of the Department of Justice, doubly insulated, which he is just, crashing through and undoing and making a mockery of this idea of special prosecutors at all. I don't even see how you would have that system function if what Barr does can actually proceed.
Well, I think you essentially both answered my questions of, is there any legitimate reason that the Department of Justice would do this? Is there any legitimate reason that the Attorney General would act this way? And I think I know the answer to those questions. I've been trying to work in the audience Q&A as we talk. And my kind of last big question will be, I think my last big question, because it's already past 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock for you, what can we expect for the future of the Department of Justice? And I know this is a really hard crystal ball question, but is the Trump administration, is the particular actions, I mean, this is a question we could ask for so many different things. Is this an aberration, or do we think that this will become, frankly, kind of new normal when it comes to presidents pressuring attorney generals, the career members of the Department of Justice essentially acting in silent and public protest in some cases of what's happening? So I think we're now at Joyce for that one.
If what's going on currently becomes the new normal, then we no longer live in a functioning constitutional republic. We've lost any semblance of being a democracy. Because to go back to your earlier question, Jessica, about why the importance of DOJ from the White House is so important, this is it, right? The president doesn't get to direct the attorney general to prosecute his enemies and give his friends a pass. That's why Jim Comey declined to do the favor that Trump wanted, just seeing his way clear to letting Mike Flynn go. That's not how a democracy works. So we're in really dangerous territory. And the question is this a stress test for our democratic institutions? And will they survive that stress test? I guess an easy way of answering that is to say, we may be able to limp across the finish line if this is 4 years and restore our democratic institutions in a thoughtful, bipartisan way afterwards. It is unlikely that these institutions survive 8 years of this sort of behavior unscathed. We really are very much, I think, right on the edge of seeing whether the institutions survive or not. And for so long, I assumed that the institutions would always get us through and that the rule of law would always be strong enough and really flexible enough to survive these times. I think, though, we're at a serious moment in our history where we may have to reconsider that. I know President Obama's conversation with some of the alums of his administration became a source of public news last week. And in that, President Obama said to alums from his administrations that he was having concern about whether these rights that we've taken for granted so long, about whether or not they could survive. Of course, the answer to where we find ourselves is free and fair elections, right? The public always has a political check on the actions of a president. And that really takes us full circle in this conversation, because that's what this counterintelligence investigation in 2016 that got us to where we are today was all about. It was whether or not Russia was trying to interfere in our elections. And as we talk about, and Jessica, you mentioned this notion that a president would maybe be a little bit out of bounds, but not too far. That's what this is really about. Will a president permit a foreign country to intervene in our elections? We need to all be vigilant and participant in the next few months, because we're in a very dangerous place.
Asha, we didn't promise people rainbows and sunshine, but we did promise a full airing of the issues, which, based on the few texts I've got from people watching, they're very happy with that. But Asha, if you want to touch on that last question, and then I am kind of weaving in the Q&A as we talk as well.
Yeah. One of the things that is so important to the rule of law is not only that that justice be served in fact, and that it actually go through the process. It is that it be perceived as being fair and impartial. And that is, really woven into the legal profession, as you know. This is why, judges recuse, even if there is the appearance of a conflict, because you never want there to be even a perception that there may be any kind of, bias or interference or influence in the outcomes, because so much of the rule of law and its legitimacy depends on how people perceive it from the outside. I'm old enough to remember that, almost 4 years ago, President Bill Clinton talking to then Attorney General Lynch about golf on a, tarmac for 5 minutes was cause for, the impropriety of it. Like how, this is interference. He wasn't even the actual president. He's, the wife of somebody who's being investigated was talking for 5 minutes. And if we think about how much shock that caused at the time, and I think there were even people who supported, Hillary, who said, that was just not a great move. You just don't want to do anything that looks like that. To what we've become so normalized to right now, to this idea that Joyce and I, as people who worked in the Department of Justice, we are looking at what Barr is doing and assuming or questioning his real motives for doing it. That is a terrible place to be, because I will say the first step is, as Joyce said, to elect someone this November that is going to restore some of these norms. But undoing the psychological erosion that has taken place in the minds of Americans as to the legitimacy of our institutions, distrusting the people that are running them, that is going to take, I think, at least a decade to get back to a place where people can really trust that these institutions are working in a way that overall is the arc of history is bending in the right direction. And I think right now that is really lost. I'm sorry that is not optimistic.
Yeah, well, okay, so this is the moment where I can't not be an election law professor. And I really just want to pick up on this issue of appearances matter when it comes to our trust in the government. Appearances matter. I mean, think about the smallest thing, like we say that it's okay to limit campaign contributions if it's corruption or if it looks like corruption, because the appearance that our government is not functioning for us, is not that our elections are not free and fair, is so disastrous to a representative democracy that even the Supreme Court, and I'm sorry to say even in that way, says, no, that's enough. If people perceive that there's a problem, if people perceive that their officials are not working for them, that's going to lead to a cycle of discontent, and ultimately our grand experiment really won't work anymore. So this isn't the topic for today, but I will say briefly, because you both brought up the election, I want people to feel very comfortable using a vote by mail ballot. And I want people to know that this is a system where there's absolutely no system that's perfect. This is a system where we have many devices in place to protect your vote, where we track ballots, where we put codes on the back of envelopes to let people know that they can check in on their ballot, make sure that it was counted. The greatest way to try and suppress the right to vote and to suppress your vote in November is to do things like scare you into what is frankly the safest, probably will be the safest way to vote, which is to get that vote by mail ballot, whether or not you need to ask for it in your state or whether or not it's a state like California and it'll be given to you, and then return it with the confidence that you can track it, and the confidence that it will be counted, and the confidence that the county registrars and the state administrators will be doing their absolute best to uphold the integrity of the election. So with that, I'm moving my soapbox to the side, and I apologize for the thank you for coming to my TED Talk, as they say. And so let's get briefly to some more of the questions and answers. And Asha, you talked about this a bit, but it's something that's coming up a number of times in the Q&A, which is, why did Flynn lie? And Peter Tracy says, serious question. He's a high-level military and NSA elect. He must know that FBI, CIA, NSA would do a deep dive on his background and monitor his calls. He must have known, so why lie?
I think that's just one of the biggest questions about this. It's so bizarre. Yes, so he should have known that, for like the Russian ambassador would be a counterintelligence surveillance target. And as I mentioned, the FBI actually jogged his memory. They didn't say we have a recording, but they actually used kind of phrases that he had used. Do you remember saying XYZ? And he said no. And the interview notes say that he was being quite jocular, like he was relaxed. So he's lying easily. So, did he just like believe his own lie, or did he believe that he was so smart he was going to get away with it? Was he so sure that the incoming administration was, just about to start that he wouldn't be investigated for lying? Was he shielding, was he afraid that if he told the truth, it would go down a road where it would expose things that, he felt there was more to lose by doing that than by just sticking with the lie? And these are all the questions where, we don't know the answer to that. What we do know is he knew he was lying, and he also knew that the FBI knew that he was lying, which is a very strange situation to be in. I don't know, Joyce. I mean, those are the different possibilities that come to my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you 100%, Asha. I think it's one of the mysterious questions. There's a lot of speculation that Flynn felt like he would be protected from the lie and that there would be no consequences for telling the lie. There's no way he didn't know, as a former DNI and as the incoming NSA, that these sorts of calls would be monitored. It remains the big mystery. What was so important here that they were protecting it? Why did the president put himself on the line for this? And why does he to this day continue to take steps to try to protect Mike Flynn? We just don't know the answer.
Yeah, and I apologize for terrible Zoom etiquette, which is looking off screen while I look at the Q&A. There's so many great questions. I'm going to ask one while I peruse, which is, and Joyce, I think we know the answer, but what's your favorite quarantine activity right now?
What's my favorite quarantine activity? I'm going to go something in between playing with the hose with my German Shepherd puppy Bella and knitting. Is that an okay answer? I mean, it has nothing to do with the law, right? But that's the truth.
It wasn't meant to have anything to do with the law. I won't ask you to do what I was asked to do earlier, which is like, stand up. Let's see if you're in, proper pants or shorts. And I can tell everybody, under oath or not under oath, I'm proudly donning the Costco pajamas that my mom got me for the holidays. Asha, favorite quarantine activity?
I've gotten really into my workout videos. I find them very fun. I don't know, it's like, this tells you about my days, and also just spending time with my kids. We're watching a lot of different shows together, various seasons of Kids Baking Show, and now we're watching Making the Cut on Amazon, which is kind of a glorified Project Runway. So I'm enjoying spending time with them.
Asha, while you were answering, I saw on my screen it blipped up and somebody said steam mopping, which made me laugh because you had recommended that steam mop on Twitter the other day.
I love my steam mop.
I apparently got like the last one that was available any place online and have been using it phonetically. And so my husband tells me this morning, he said, that steam mop is really great. It's life-changing.
It's life-changing.
Yeah. It's my favorite thing. That really is my favorite thing to do in quarantine.
For quarantine silver linings.
Yeah. My floors are beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is what the Hammer Forums are about. One, making me feel sedentary because I'm not doing workout videos. Two, like a slob because I'm not steam mopping. But three, changing lives for the better. And I think the the few hundred people that we still have on. I hear a lot of people talk about floorboards. I mean, I know that the kind of the trope now is yeast and sourdough and starters, but I hear a lot about steam mopping and floors. So I think you started a trend. Okay, here is a question that's come up in a few iterations in different ways, and I think it's a good one to ask because it allows us to learn a little bit more about the judicial system, which is, will the public, this is from Paul, will the public ever be able to see behind the curtain, as you mentioned with Judge Sullivan? Treason is not a word that's thrown around very lightly. And Joyce, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, sure. And so I'll just, we don't know for certain, but I'll say that the judge may have been using treason generically, because treason, one of the few crimes that's actually identified in the Constitution in our system as opposed to by statute, it is something that's very different, something that really doesn't fall into the rubric of what was done here, simply because it requires that we be in a formal and declared state of war with a foreign enemy for treason to exist. So I think he was using it more generically. But your question really goes to this, Paul. Will we ever find out what Judge Sullivan knows? Do we ever get to see all of the redactions in the Moller Report? Do we ever get access to classified information? And the answer is probably not for a very long time. I think that this is more the domain of historians than it is the domain of pundits and of current observers, and that's frustrating for many of us. These answers increasingly in a world that consists of the internet and 24-hour TV news cycles, more leaks out than maybe would have during the Nixon administration. But I think a lot of this is in the domain of history, unfortunately.
Asha, do you want to pick up on that, or?
Yeah, I think that, this kind of goes to what Joyce has discussed before, and I have also, is the difference between a counterintelligence investigation and a criminal investigation. And part of the reason that it's very hard to, people are like, why don't we prosecute more spies? Why aren't people charged? It's because when you go into a courtroom, you have to lay out your cards. And sometimes doing that will compromise national security. A lot of, there were pieces of this that made their way into the criminal justice process, but there are lots of pieces of this which was about us trying to figure out what Russian intelligence was doing in the United States. And so that is not necessarily something that the government wants to lay out on the table, because in the game of spy versus spy, your advantage is never letting your adversary know what you know. You want them to be guessing. You don't want to lay out, hey, yeah, so I think, the very fact that they were willing to prosecute this and put out there that, they have this, phone call. I mean, even if, foreign diplomats believe that we're surveilling them, we typically don't say it. We play this like gentleman's game where, in the diplomatic world where everybody is, respected, and the counterintelligence side happens in the back burner. Only in very serious cases does it come forward. So no, I don't think so. I think there's entire parts of the Mueller investigation that will never see the light of day, because they're incredibly sensitive and could compromise sources and methods. And I think it's too bad, because I've always described, when the Mueller investigation was going on, that these charges are like if you were only shown like 5 scenes in a 2-hour movie and then asked to put together like the entire plot line. I mean, you could probably make something up. You might be able to, from those scenes, fill out the background, but you really need to see the whole movie to understand the entire story. And that's kind of where we are, but there is a tension there that I think ultimately between transparency and what's in the interests of national security.
Okay, I think that we're going to do 2 more questions. We've done actually you two have done a heroic job of getting through most of the questions. We've touched on a lot of it. One question that comes up in a lot of different iterations is essentially, what do we know about Judge Sullivan? I said, talk to us about Michael Flynn. We know about some of the other characters. I think that Asha, in the beginning, you said, people that have become household names like George Papadopoulos, but What do we know about the federal judge who, at least for now, and I expect for a while, is in charge of this case?
Joyce.
So, you know, Judge Sullivan has a little bit of history with the Justice Department. In the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, there was the prosecution of an Alaska senator named Ted Stevens. It went poorly. Judge Sullivan was the judge. He perceived that DOJ prosecutors had withheld something called Brady evidence. Brady is evidence that a defendant could arguably use to exculpate himself, to argue that he's not guilty. And Judge Sullivan believed that prosecutors withheld that evidence from Senator Stevens. He ultimately, after appointing someone from the outside to conduct an investigation into those prosecutors' conduct, you know, that's very unusual. And by the time these proceedings had untangled, we were into the Obama administration. Eric Holder was the Attorney General. Holder maintained that DOJ could sufficiently investigate the conduct of its own prosecutors. But Judge Sullivan took this extraordinary step of appointing an outside lawyer to look at the conduct, publicly was very unhappy with the way the prosecutors had afforded themselves. And this led to a nationwide review of discovery practices inside of the Justice Department. Holder actually required every U.S. Attorney's Office and the litigating components to disclose their policies. They had never been disclosed publicly before. They became available on offices' websites. Offices were required to engage in a very thoughtful evaluation of their practices. There couldn't be nationwide uniformity because every court had different rules, but it was a very thorough, detailed process prompted by this same federal judge who now has the Flynn case, who wanted to see DOJ accountable to rule of law principles. An interesting judge to tangle with in this situation.
Yeah, we have some really educated participants here who alluded to that background, and it's I don't know if ironic is the word, but very interesting that Judge Sullivan is the one ending up with this case. So
one wonders if Bill Barr was a student of history when he chose to tangle with this judge.
One wonders so many things about that particular situation. And so here's where I'm going to end. I thought this was a really interesting question, which is for both of you, you get to sit down one-on-one, first with President Trump and then with Michael Flynn. And let's assume this wasn't in the question, but let's assume truth serum. And so what are the few questions that you would ask of each of them? Asha, if it's okay, I'll start with you.
Well, I think with Trump, my question would be, why won't you ever say anything bad about Vladimir Putin? I think that's one of, I mean, it's not so puzzling, I guess, really, but it's definitely striking because he's somebody who doesn't seem to shy away from, pushing back, as he says, against, basically anyone else, but yet he tiptoes, on eggshells when it comes to Putin and seemingly to not make him angry. I mean, I think the problem with ever asking Trump a question is that you're never going to get a truthful answer. So there's a lot of questions I'd want to ask, but, you get some kind of, tap dancing around. But that would be the question that if I could get an honest answer, that would be the one that I'd want to know.
And anything for Michael Flynn? Maybe we kind of hit on it in the beginning.
I think
why?
The why. Well, I think the question for him is, what happened to you? Because what it seems is that he was quite well regarded, and somewhere in there, he turned. And I don't know if I can, if we fully know that in the counterintelligence sense, but he turned, like he shifted. And I think people who have been around him have kind of said this, that he became a different person. And from what I understand, there were aspects of his personality that may have lended itself to kind of, if anything, becoming a fellow traveler, as they say in, Russian intelligence, which is sort of a, just an unwitting but voluntary person who kind of gets on board. But why, when you're a decorated general, when you were someone who had a position of public trust, who served the country, why do whatever it is that made Judge Sullivan characterize, even colloquially, what you did as treason?
Joyce, you're in a room with President Trump, and maybe some truth serum, maybe some tap dancing.
So, I agree with Asha here. The why questions are so fascinating. And it's a facet of our criminal justice system that as a prosecutor, you're prosecuting a defendant for committing a crime, you have to prove all the elements of that crime, the pieces of that crime that the statute says you must prove. And it's only with very rare exceptions that prosecutors have to prove a motive, maybe in some of the hate crimes where you have to prove racial animus. But typically, you have to prove, as Asha referenced earlier, an actus reus, right? An act that someone did, and a mens rea, a state of mind, and then maybe some attendant circumstances, like you robbed a bank that was federally insured. But you don't have to prove why the robber went in and robbed the bank. A motive is compelling. It can provide really interesting evidence that can help a jury perceive the evidence in a way that lets them get to a guilty verdict, but it's only very rarely an essential piece of the government's proof. Here, though, we walk away from these cases really with so many why questions unanswered. Why does the president not criticize Russia for trying to interfere with our elections? Why does a decorated intelligence officer seem to have this sudden change in the middle of his career, so that President Obama, one of the few things that he said to President Trump was he warned him off of bringing Mike Flynn into his own White House? These why questions are compelling, and they're still largely unanswered.
Perfect. So I'm going to break my promise. I'm not going to bring the poll back up because I wanted to have every moment with these brilliant ladies instead of looking at the poll. Thank you so much, professors, for sharing your knowledge with all of us. This has really, for me, been extraordinary, and I learned an enormous amount, even though I felt like I was educated. I felt like I read this stuff and I follow this. I learned so much more today, and we're really, really grateful for your time. I wish that you could see what the panelists, what the participants have been saying. They're very grateful for your time. So with that, we should tell the audience, steam mop, play with your dog, work out, do something with your kids, and feel very comfortable voting in November. If it's by mail, feel comfortable doing that. If it's in an early voting center and you're spaced apart, please feel comfortable doing that. Please just participate. And with that, music is going to play us off. Thank you, everyone, so much.